Hi, I'm Katie Miranda. Welcome to the Palestine Solidarity Telesummit. Today I am here with Mouin Rabbani. Mouin, could you introduce yourself?
Hi, Katie. Good to be with you. My name is Mouin Rabbani. I'm an independent researcher and analyst specializing on Palestine, the Arab-Israeli conflict, and the contemporary Middle East. And I'm currently a senior fellow with the Institute for Palestine Studies in Washington, D.C.
So this telesummit is about what's working in the movement for Palestinian rights and what's not. And one of the things that Mouin and I talked about earlier was rebuilding the Palestinian national movement. Can you tell us more about that, Mouin, and why that is so important to moving forward into a strategy that works?
Well, briefly, I don't think you can have a successful Palestinian strategy about anything unless it's led by a coherent national movement that serves as a collective institution for all the various Palestinian political organizations, that has credible leadership, that's able to mobilize the Palestinian people and their resources, that is able to represent the Palestinians internationally, and so on. And I think the primary challenge facing Palestinians today is that they are highly fragmented politically, geographically, and in various other ways. And the national movement, such as it is in an advanced state of disintegration, not only because of the schism between Fatah and Hamas and the geographical divisions between Palestinians inside Israel, Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and in exile, but also the disintegration of the various, or the fragmentation, and in some cases disintegration of the various constituents of the Palestinian national movement, whether we look at it politically or geographically or demographically. And therefore, it's been my view that the prerequisite for any Palestinian strategy, let alone one that can succeed, is that Palestinians need to find a way to revive and rebuild and rejuvenate their national movement.
And is that going on right now? Are you a part of that?
No, I'm not. And unfortunately, that's not something that's taking place presently. To the contrary, what we find is that the institutional and political and geographical divisions and fragmentation of Palestinians is, if anything, becoming even deeper, where you find that the various Palestinian factions or political organizations seem more preoccupied with their rivalry with each other than acting collectively to confront what can only be characterized as existential threats facing their political future.
That's a really good point. And I actually observed that on a microcosm when I lived in Palestine because you'd have different families in different villages and neighborhoods who were kind of at odds with each other more than they were at odds with the occupation and the soldiers and the settlers. So I found that to be really kind of frustrating. Excuse me. Do you know what is going on to kind of heal those wounds and bring people back together, bring the various resistance groups back together, etc.?
Well, there are a variety of initiatives. Some are, for example, focused on achieving reconciliation and a common agenda between the two main protagonists, which are Fatah and Hamas. Others are looking at how an agreement can be reached between these organizations within the framework of the Palestinian Authority. And then there are others whose approach I find more convincing, which is that, on the one hand, these efforts should not be limited or focused exclusively on Fatah and Hamas, but rather should take place within a broader national framework. In other words, it should also include and incorporate the various other Palestinian political organizations, in addition to various Palestinian movements and social groups that are not explicitly political organizations. And secondly, that these efforts should be focused on reviving what remains the internationally recognized sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, which is the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, and that therefore these efforts should be focused on finding a formula for the integration of Hamas and Islamic Jihad within the institutional framework of the PLO on the basis of a common political program, so that the various actions these political organizations take complement rather than contradict each other. And this could then form the basis for a collective national program for some form of power sharing between the main political organizations, for the establishment of a new and more credible, perhaps initially collective leadership, and of an organization that actually enjoys legitimacy among the Palestinians, credibility regionally and internationally, and is therefore capable of mobilizing the Palestinians and their allies in a much more purposeful manner than has been the case so far. Excuse me.
Is anything like that actually happening, like exactly what you just said?
Well, there are various ideas being floated around, and there are initiatives being undertaken in this direction by, various Palestinian organizations and activists and intellectuals and so on. But I think what's missing so far is, first of all, the commitment to such an outcome by the organizations themselves. And secondly, let's not forget that there's also now very deep-rooted regional polarization, where the sponsors and benefactors of the rival organizations, rather than pushing them to cooperate, are in a way holding them hostage to regional agendas. And one can think, for example, of the Saudi-Iranian polarization, the Saudi Emirati-Qatari polarization, the regional tug of war between Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and of course, I would say that the West has also played a very damaging role, particularly the United States, but also the European Union, in putting all kinds of obstacles in the way of any initiative to incorporate Hamas and Islamic Jihad into the PLO.
Okay, so I just had this strange idea in my head. I understand what you're saying about all these different regional players and partners having their own agendas, but what's actually stopping like somebody from Hamas, somebody from Fatah, from somebody from the PLO, and somebody from Islamic Jihad to like sit in an actual room together without, any of these foreign governments, what's stopping them from sitting in a room and saying, look, we got to,
Well, there have been such initiatives, if you will, and these have taken place primarily among Palestinian prisoners representing various factions. I think
that's really interesting.
What you found.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
I think what you've found in the past is that these organizations are highly dependent on their regional and, in some cases, international sponsors for funding, for political support. One could argue for their very survival. And also you have kind of prominent individuals who are sponsored by and beholden to a variety of outside powers. And then, faced with these choices, you often find that personal or factional interests win the day. and take precedence over any national interest.
I see. That's seems like a very difficult situation, having so much foreign influence. That's in a
I
way.
should add,
Yeah, go
I
ahead.
should add, yes, there definitely is this foreign influence, and this foreign influence most certainly has played a negative role. But I think it would also be an exaggeration to say that it is only because of these outside influences that we are where we are today. You also have local Palestinian actors that are, in a sense, by choice, more invested in the status quo than in any kind of scenario such as we've been discussing, because they would lose all kinds of roles and perks and privileges were that to succeed. So it's really a mutually reinforcing combination of factors.
I see. What resistance or strategy is working in Palestine in general?
I would argue that presently there's very little that's working. I mean, if you look at what's taking place, you have, for example, these demonstrations in the West Bank against certain sections of the wall. You have the return marches in the Gaza Strip. You have negotiations for the sake of negotiation strategy of Palestinian Authority, which has now become a tactic of boycotting the U.S. administration because of its unprecedented strategic bias towards the most extreme Israeli agenda towards the Palestinians. And then you also have, of course, the armed resistance in the Gaza Strip. Now, the problem with all of these is that any successes that they achieve tend to be, I would argue, local and ephemeral in nature, in part because either these are localized initiatives that are not being adopted and promoted and strengthened by any national framework, and on the other hand, because what you would find often is that these tactics are operating in contradiction with each other, and rather than being mutually reinforcing, um, you often find that one is pursued in order to weaken the other in this broader context of factional rivalry that we've been discussing. And therefore, I once again come back to the point that the most urgent priority and essential prerequisite for the Palestinians is to find a common institutional framework for all their activities, and to agree upon a unified and collective strategic approach. And without that, I think we'll continue to see Palestinians conducting these various activities and initiatives at an increasingly high cost with increasingly limited or at best localized outcomes.
What strategies or tactics are not working right now or have not worked in the past and people shouldn't do them?
Well, I'm tempted to give you the same answer I just did to your previous question, um, uh, precisely because in the current political and institutional context, it's very difficult for any of these initiatives to achieve any kind of strategic success. Having said that, I think the most obvious candidate for failure is the strategy of bilateral negotiations with Israel under exclusive United States sponsorship within the framework of the Oslo agreements, which, contrary to what many describe as its failure or death, is most unfortunately still alive and well and kicking. And I think one of the most urgent priorities for the Palestinians has to be to find a way to extricate the Palestinians and the national movement and the political system from kind of the web of relationships and commitments that have been produced by the Oslo Agreement since the early 1990s. And practically, realistically speaking, it's very easy to kind of categorically denounce and dismiss the position, but to then find a way to extricate the Palestinians from it is, I think, going to be a much more difficult challenge.
So you're saying they need to get themselves out of this kind of endless continuation of, oh, let's go back into talks with the Israeli government. But I don't even think that's happening right now, is it? They're not really in talks. It's
No,
just
and I'm not talking exclusively about negotiations, though I would suggest that the prospects of the resumption of such negotiations are perhaps somewhat greater than might be anticipated, simply because it is the only strategy that the Palestinian leadership in Ramallah has, and it has firmly opposed any alternative approach to relations with Israel. And so, even though, as you correctly point out, there currently are no negotiations, there are certain kinds of relationships, for example, security collaboration, and so on, and economic subservience and dependency and all the rest of it, that persist, and that the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank continues to adopt, because it sees this as forming a basis for an eventual resumption of bilateral negotiations with Israel.
does the Palestinian Authority support the BDS movement?
To the best of my understanding, it doesn't. Its official position is that it supports a boycott of Israeli settlements and other Israeli activities in the occupied territories without adopting or promoting a more comprehensive boycott of Israel. Now, I would respond to that with two comments, which is, as you know, a number of researchers have, I think, conclusively and convincingly demonstrated. You know, given that Israel makes no distinction between east and west of the Green Line, and that the Israeli economy and institutions and so on in the occupied territories are so intimately intertwined and firmly enmeshed in the broader Israeli economy, it's extremely difficult to target any boycott exclusively at Israeli enterprises beyond the Green Line, because you follow the thread and it invariably leads back to a government entity or bank or whatever operating within Israel. Secondly, I think the PA attitude is somewhat reminiscent of a previous initiative, let's say over the past 10 years or so, where the Palestinian leadership in the West Bank was consistently calling for what it termed peaceful resistance, popular mobilization and nonviolent resistance and so on. And what you found is that ultimately, and I think many people saw through it from the outset, but that notwithstanding, what it really was not a call for popular mobilization and nonviolent resistance. It was not a strategy that the PA either supported or promoted. Rather, it was raising it as a slogan to, let's say, delegitimize armed resistance and to create kind of a political context for the disarmament of the Palestinian militias and so on. And once that had been succeeded, not only did the leadership do absolutely nothing to promote and support popular mobilization, but when you did get such initiatives, such as these wall demonstrations we were discussing earlier, they were, if anything, passively or more actively opposed to them, because the PA sees any kind of popular mobilization as a potential threat to its own position.
So what does the PA think is going to move this situation forward? Because they're not supporting any kind of resistance. They're not really supporting BDS. They're kind of just sitting there. I mean that's kind of my perspective. Is that correct?
Probably. You ask a question to which I wonder whether, even the leadership concerned has an answer. I suspect that their current position in the context of the Trump administration's adoption of what is essentially an extremist Israeli right wing agenda as formal U.S. policy and taking all kinds of unilateral measures to try to force through a resolution of core issues separating Israelis and Palestinians, like Jerusalem, the refugee question, and so on. I suspect that if you're talking about PA PLO leadership, their current position is one of kind of waiting out the Trump years in the hope that something better will emerge subsequently, while keeping some key relationships, such as between the Palestinian security forces and the CIA and the Pentagon and so on, keeping certain relationships with Israel operational, so that there isn't a complete rupture. But what history teaches us, including in the recent past, is that every time a U.S. administration comes to an end, it is typically characterized by Israel correctly as the most pro-Israeli U.S. administration ever. This is true of every subsequent U.S. administration, and I think that if Palestinian leaders have the illusion that the next American president, whether Republican or Democratic, is going to in any way reverse the measures that the Trump administration has taken of, for example, recognizing Israeli sovereignty over Jerusalem and relocating the U.S. embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. These things are not going to be reversed voluntarily. It's going to require a much more sustained campaign and effort by the Palestinians locally, regionally, and internationally to be able to neutralize these American initiatives.
What strategies are working coming from the international community? What's producing results,
Well,
positive results?
I don't really see any international initiatives, whether ones that are working or not working. If you're talking at the governmental level, my sense is that the international community, and particularly, for example, the Europeans, who have perhaps the highest degree of influence um, uh, in the region and on this conflict, are effectively adopting policies that perpetuate the status quo, have essentially taken a decision to neither confront nor punish Israel for any of its measures towards the Palestinians, which are not only illegal under international law, but which are characterized by the Europeans themselves as illegal. What we've seen in recent years is where the EU and Europeans take even a rhetorical stand against certain Israeli measures, that for all their tough talk and immediate accusations of anti Semitism and so on, Israel folds fairly quickly and easily. And this demonstrates, I think, that if the international community were to not only talk the talk but also walk the walk, Israel could be fairly easily curtailed and called to order.
What strategies coming from the international community are not working and people should stop doing them? Or did you kind of answer that?
You, your voice fell away, so you're going to have to repeat that.
Oh, I said, what strategies or tactics coming from the international community are not working and people should stop doing them?
Well, again, this, I think if we were to speak, let's talk about the West rather than the international community as a whole. Um, uh, what they are effectively doing is perpetuating the status quo, looking the other way while Israeli colonial expansion in the occupied territories continues apace, while at the same time not counterbalancing that with any measures that that would be supporting Palestinian rights and interests. For example, Sweden recognized Palestinian statehood, um, a symbolic but not unimportant move. But none of the other uh, European states have followed suit. So, on the one hand, they tolerate um, uh, virtually each and every Israeli unilateral action, including those that are, grave violations of international law and so on, while at the same time withholding their support from any Palestinian initiative, including those that are entirely consistent with international law. And I think the broader lesson to be learned here is that salvation is not going to come from the international community, least of all from the Europeans, who have a record of being either hopelessly biased or, cowardly neutral when it comes to this issue. And this brings us back, I think, to the initial part of our discussion, which is that salvation is only going to come from the Palestinians themselves. And only once the Palestinians put their own house in order will they have the power and leverage to be able to line up, the Arab states and regional powers and so on behind a clear agenda, and in that way to exercise influence on international actors, like, for example, the Europeans.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Mouin.
Okay, pleasure speaking with you.